friends, I'm INIFD and today I'm going to be talking about the architecture of one of the old civilizations of the world. If you know that the history of man tells us that ancient man settled down around the rivers, and that's where the civilizations took off. One of the ancient civilizations of that is the Huanghe civilization, or what we call the ancient Chinese civilization, which was along the river Huanghe. So today I'm going to be talking about the ancient Chinese architecture. Well, architecture, if you all know, reflects or tells about the culture of that very country. And the ancient Chinese architecture basically reflects the harmonious unity of human beings with nature. And that can be seen when we look at any of the old buildings that are there in China. If you look at the housing, well, they are made to fit to the dimension of the human form. Unlike the buildings that we see in the West, which are very, very huge and very big, the ancient housing shows us that the houses were made to fit the human dimension, because that kind of gave a very safe and intimate feel to the whole structure. Another thing that we see in the old ancient houses or the buildings or the palaces or anything else is that the walls of those buildings are very, very plain. The facade is not very, very ornamented. It's very minimal in decoration, because we must understand that the Chinese people practice moderation. And what I mean by moderation is that you are not supposed to be expressing yourself in a very loud way. And that can be seen when we look at any of the buildings in ancient China. Besides that, the influence of culture also can be seen in the buildings, the structures which are there existing in China from the olden times. And that can be seen when we see the building, the site that was chosen for a particular building. The entire influence on that, the choosing of that site was as per Feng Shui. That's one of the traditional methods of space planning in China. So what site, what should be the orientation, how should the thing be made? It was all basically as per Feng Shui. So this is what I mean when I say that architecture is the carrier of culture, and that can be seen in the ancient Chinese buildings in ancient China. When I talk about ancient Chinese architecture, I'm sure in your minds one thing that is running is the Great Wall of China. But that's not all. Ancient Chinese architecture is not just the Great Wall of China, it's much more than that. It is about the exquisite looking gardens, the extravagant palaces, or beautiful temples, or for that matter these imposing large pagodas. So that is what ancient Chinese architecture is all about. And when we look at all these structures, one thing that comes to our mind is that if you look at them closely and if you observe them closely, you will see that most of them are balanced. There is symmetry in their construction. So that's one thing. Besides that, if you look at the roofs, that's another thing that comes to your mind when you think of Chinese architecture. It's those elaborate sloping roofs, those upturned corners of the roof. Well, there was reason for that, and one of the reasons was the Buddhist philosophy, which says that if you have those upturned roofs, then that was a way of warding off the evil. So that's how culture also influences, or you can say the religious beliefs influences the way a building is constructed. So at the very outset, let us understand the characteristic features of ancient Chinese architecture. First, if you look at all the buildings, what you see is bilateral symmetry. I talked about symmetry in the beginning, the balance and symmetry that I was talking about. Since most of the ancient Chinese buildings were made as per Feng Shui, and that promotes balance and symmetry in construction. So when I talk about bilateral symmetry, is like if if you have a structure and you run a line right in the middle, then the left side looks like a mirror image of the right side. So that is what I mean by bilateral symmetry, and most of the ancient Chinese structures and buildings that were constructed had this bilateral symmetry. The other characteristic feature of ancient Chinese architecture is, or very distinctly, is the unique timber framework. Timber, if I put it in simpler language, timber means wood, and wood was abundantly available in China. So, but obviously that became the material for construction. So most of the ancient Chinese buildings are made of timber. The framework, the kind of construction is trabeated. When I mean trabeated, is the use of columns or and the beams. The beams are the lintels and the columns are the posts. So post and lintel construction is the basic construction technique that was adopted by the ancient Chinese. The timber framework gave an advantage to the buildings that were constructed. One, the loading of the building, that is the roof loading or the loading of the top floors, did not come onto the walls. It basically got transferred by these lintels onto the columns into the ground. So the people could design their spaces as per their requirements. See, there are two kinds of construction techniques. Either your walls become load bearing, that is, all the load which is coming from the top is going to go onto these walls and down to the foundation. And the other kind of construction is that you have a framework and all the load is transferred onto this framework and then goes down to the foundation. And that is exactly the advantage which this unique timber framework gave to the ancient Chinese buildings. So the load got transferred, and the people, the ancient Chinese, had the advantage of distributing the space as per their requirements. They could open a window wherever they required, they could place a partition wall wherever they wanted to, and that really did not matter because the walls did not bear the loading of the structure. So that is the second characteristic feature of the ancient Chinese architecture. The third feature that will be hierarchy. And by the word hierarchy, what I mean is giving the most important part of the building more emphasis and then going on to the other lesser important parts of the building. So most of the ancient Chinese architectural buildings had the most important rooms, or you can say the structures, along a particular axis, and the lesser important structures were then next to it, and then the least important right on the periphery. So that is how most of the buildings were constructed. Even inside interiors, the important rooms were placed along an axis and the lesser important rooms came next to that. So that is what I mean by hierarchy. The other characteristic feature of ancient Chinese architecture is enclosure. Enclosure means an open space that would be left, just like we have in our ancient Indian architecture also. We have that courtyard in the middle of a house. So most of the ancient Chinese architectural buildings had this open courtyard in the middle and the other rooms were designed around it. Now that was very, very good if you look at it from the architectural point of view, because it was a natural way of ventilating the entire space. So all the hot air which was building up in that area would rise up from this open courtyard area and the cool air would take place. So that was a way kind of ventilating the whole thing. Plus all the rooms got sunlight, which is a natural source of light. So that is what I mean by enclosure. Even if they were not a courtyard in the middle of a house, the structures, if I talk about say many buildings, then there would be a skywell in the middle. So they would not be just clustered up together. The buildings would be placed in such a fashion that there would be a skywell in the middle. So that was also what we understand by enclosure. So those are those four characteristic features of ancient Chinese architecture. The fifth characteristic feature of ancient Chinese architecture would be horizontal emphasis. If you remember what I said in the beginning, the Chinese people practice moderation. By moderation, what I mean is that they do not like to show off or promote a lot of self-expression. They believe in moderation, not attract attention, and that can be seen in the emphasis of the horizontal line. Horizontal line means that is, if you want to make a building, let it be only of one floor or two floors, and let it not go very, very high. So any of the ancient Chinese buildings, palaces that you look at, they are very, very wide, but they do not go up. Just if you compare it to the architecture of the West, if you look at the churches and the cathedrals which came up during the Gothic period, they all emphasize the vertical axis, because for them to be going higher and higher was a way of showing majesty. But in Chinese architecture, you had to be grounded, you had to be practicing moderation, and that's where you emphasize on the horizontal axis and not on the vertical axis. The only I can say structure which opposes this horizontal emphasis would be the pagoda. So that we'll pick up when I talk about the different styles of architecture of ancient Chinese architecture. The sixth point that we have to think of in characteristic features is the cosmological concepts. And in cosmological concepts, what I mean is their practice of Feng Shui, the ancient traditional method of space planning, while designing their structures. So if it is any of those theories which they have, that is which site to take up, like in Feng Shui they say that there should be a running stream around a site where you are making a house, or there should be a high looking hill at the backdrop. All those points were kept in mind while designing or while building a structure. And lastly, the characteristic feature of ancient Chinese architecture would be the ornamentation. How did they decorate their structures? Of course, the most distinct thing that comes to our mind when we think of the Chinese building is the amazing painting, the painting work. You have to remember, they constructed in wood, and that gave them the chance to paint it or decorate up their beams, their columns, the rafters, all that was painted, and that is why the painting is highly, highly advanced in ancient China. So that was the way to ornament their rafters which they were using for roofs, or the columns which they were doing. They were all very carved. The brackets that they were using were very, very carved. So that was the way they decorated their interiors. They used a lot of stone statues. So you would find stone statues outside the house, huge lions or any other mythological figures, or even human forms with spears and guarding the entire space outside. So stone statues were another way of decorating in ancient China. So, and besides that, the walls that they used, they were all screen walls. The lattice work and the fretwork screen walls which were used for ornamentation. So I'll just repeat the characteristic features of ancient Chinese architecture. 1. Bilateral symmetry, unique timber framework, hierarchy, enclosure, horizontal emphasis, cosmological concepts, and finally the ornamentation. Let's discuss about the various architectural styles in the ancient Chinese architecture. Well, we broadly classify the architectural styles in 4 categories: the Imperial architecture, the Buddhist architecture, the Taoist architecture, and the garden architecture. So first, let's focus on the Imperial architecture. The word Imperial, as you all understand, implies royal. So all the architecture which is associated with the emperor and would come under this category. So in Imperial architecture, first it it is the Imperial Mausoleum architecture. Mausoleum, if I have to tell you in simpler language, stands for tomb, or a place where a dead emperor is buried. So the Imperial Mausoleum architecture is the architecture which is highly exquisite because the nation's best architects and artisans were employed to make this structure. The site location of this structure was usually on a hilltop overlooking the entire town, or it would be on a mountain top, so it looked over at the entire town. So by locating this structure on a hilltop, it was kind of emphasizing this whole structure. And as you know, in ancient China, the emperor was almost like God. So he was supposed to be placed on a higher pedestal, and that's where most of the imperial mausoleums were placed. Since I said the best artisans were used, so we see a very good carving here. We see very, very nice ornamentations and paintings in these tombs. Most of these tombs had very broad way going up to the tomb. This was called the Shendao, or the sacred way. It was like symbolic of the king going towards the heaven. So this Shendao is what lines, or is the entrance to the tombs of the emperors. The Shendao had these mythological figures or statues of huge lions or any of the other mythological figures which were on the two sides, which guarded this sacred way. It was in a way to say that it was there to ward off the evil. So that was the Imperial Mausoleum architecture, very, very impressive, and it just reflected the power, the strength of the emperor in those times. The other category which comes in the imperial architecture is the imperial palaces. Now the imperial palaces, whether you talk about the Apang Palace of the Qin dynasty, or the Wayang Palace of the Han dynasty, or to the recent Forbidden City by the Ming and the Qing dynasty, all these palaces with time became larger and larger and more impressive. So we see in the palaces, especially if I have to focus, I would like to focus on the Forbidden City, or you can say the Forbidden Palace, which is in today's world the largest palace of the world. It has almost 9,999 rooms or palaces in the entire complex. The elements which were used in this palace were all culture-based, philosophy-based, the various theories that the ancient Chinese people followed. The Feng Shui masters were exclusively used by the emperor to finalize on the site. Like the Forbidden City has a water body next to it. Since there was no mountain feature which is supposed to be there for any of the houses or palaces to be built, a coal hill was built, a man-made hill was built as per Feng Shui. So we see that Feng Shui is followed to the last in this palace. The use of number 9 is distinctly used here. Number 9, it's the highest odd number. It is supposed to be a symbolic of yang, the positive energy, and the emperors used it for themselves. So the number 9 can be seen in the Forbidden City, whether it is the columns that they use, it will be 9 or a multiple of 9. It could be 81, it could be 27. So that is how they manipulated the use of number 9. The other thing that we see in the Forbidden City is the use of color yellow. Yellow in China stands for royal color. Yellow also is considered auspicious because, as we know, that the Chinese civilization happened along the Huanghe River, which is also called the Yellow River, and for them the color yellow is symbolic of earth, the earth, the mother earth, and that is why yellow is considered a very auspicious number, and it was exclusively reserved for the royal house. or the royal palaces. So the roofs in the Forbidden City were done up in yellow color, and that color was not to be used by any other person in the town. So the yellow color was exclusively used by the emperor. We also see the paintings of dragons and phoenix. Dragon in Chinese is long and phoenix is feng. And these are the lucky totems of the Chinese people. Dragon standing for the emperor and phoenix stands for the empress. And that is why we see a lot of use of dragon, whether it is sculpture or it's painting on the walls, or it's simply the fabric or the dress that the emperor wore. They all had dragon as a motive. It was a lucky thing that they used. Lion is another thing that is used in and around the palace complex. So that is the Imperial Mausoleum and the Imperial Palace, which comes in the Imperial style. The other style of Chinese is the Buddhist architectural style. Buddhism, as you all know, came from India into China in 2nd century during the late Han Dynasty, and it influenced the architecture as a whole. Because, like I said, in China, it's the philosophy, the religious beliefs, all that plays a lot of role. Culture plays a lot of role in the architecture. So, in the Buddhist architecture, we have three categories: the temple architecture, the pagodas, and the grottos. Now, initially, when Buddhism traveled to China, the temples were made on the lines of the way they were made back here in India, like the stupas that we find in Bihar. So that's how the temples were. But then they took off on their own, they developed their own style, and that's how the pagodas came up. Focusing on the pagoda, pagoda is a multi-storied, the only building structure in ancient China which is on the vertical axis. Otherwise, most of the Chinese structures, like I said earlier, they all emphasize on the horizontal axis. So the pagodas are those multi-storied building structures which were initially made in the temple complex to have an overview of the entire complex. So that's how they came up, and then of course later and today they're used for various reasons, and they're distinctly very Chinese. When I talk about a pagoda, we know that that's Chinese. If you look at the pagoda, if you look at the cut section plan or the iconography, they were usually either rectangular or they were 6-sided, hexagonal or octagonal or 12-sided. So that was the iconography of the pagodas. They were beautifully ornamented, and they were made of various materials. They were made of bricks, they were made of stone, even metal pagodas, and even wooden pagodas. So pagodas were, they are distinctly Buddhist architectural style which we talk about. The third category that comes under Buddhist architecture is the grotto complexes. Now, grottos are basically cave temples. Like if I have to compare it to the Indian architecture, that the caves that we see in Ajanta and Ellora, the Buddhist caves that if you have ever visited Ajanta and Ellora, those temple complexes which are carved out of the hills, on the hills. So those were the grotto complexes. They were cave temples dedicated to Lord Buddha and his teachings. So from outside they looked very, very normal. In fact, they didn't even look very, very impressive. But you had to enter the cave to actually look at the beauty, the carvings that were done, the kind of fresco paintings, the mural work that was done inside. That was the grotto complexes, influenced again by the Buddhist architecture back in India. The third category of the architectural style is the Taoist architecture. Taoism is a kind of, it's a religion. It was a philosophy which was started by Lao Tse. He was a great philosopher and thinker in ancient China. And one of the things that most of the Taoists believe in is that human cosmos must follow natural cosmos. That is, you have to be in harmony with nature if you want to progress. At any time or any point of time in your life, if you go against the laws of nature, then that would get you destruction. So in Taoist architecture, the architects or the people followed the philosophy of Taoism, which says moderation, which talks about meditation, which talks about being in harmony with nature. So in Taoist architectural style, we have the traditional architectural style and the Bagua traditional style. In the traditional architectural style, we have absolute symmetry and balance that we see, and hierarchy, where along the main axis you would have the important buildings and on the periphery you will have lesser important buildings. The northwest corner of most of the temples made in the traditional style would have lucky land to meet God. So that was traditional Taoist architecture. The Bagua style follows this radial symmetry, in which in the center would be the stove for the making pills of immortality, that's called the Danlu, and around it all the other structures would be put. In the Taoist architecture, many motifs are used which have symbolic significance, like you would have tortoise, and because in Taoism tortoise stands for long life, so tortoise would be carved out somewhere or it would be painted. There would be the use of cypress or the pine tree, or crane, that bird with long legs, because crane would mean a man of honor. So in all, basically whatever the Taoism preaches and teaches the people is reflected in Taoist architecture. It is an architecture of moderation which doesn't ask for attention, but again it follows the theories which are taught by Taoism. The fourth style, architectural style of Chinese architecture, is the garden architecture. Now what we call today the modern landscaping, for Chinese it was always there. So gardens, how they came about, the brief history is the emperors, the kings, they wanted a place where they could go hunting. They wanted to make their sport of hunting quite close to them. So instead of going to the jungles, what they did is they made man-made jungles next to their wherever the dynasty, kingdom, capital was. So that is how the garden architecture came about. So initially it was basically grounds for hunting, and then slowly with each dynasty the inclusion of water bodies, the waterfalls, the structures, they kept building up, and garden architecture became a part of all architecture. So if you were making a house or a palace or any other complex, the presence of garden was very much important. So in garden architecture, we have again four categories. We have the Imperial garden architecture, that is the gardens, the exquisite beautiful gardens which are laid out in the palace complexes. They are all man-made, but the way they are made, they don't even look, they gel so well with the environment around that it looks as if they have been there for ages and naturally. So that is the beauty of laying out a garden in the ancient garden architecture that the Chinese had. They laid out the gardens in such a fashion that it blended very well with the surroundings. The other gardens that we found were the private gardens, or the gardens which were found attached to the houses in cities or towns. These were very relatively smaller gardens, but again they were very aesthetically pleasing, beautifully planned out with the the trees, the shrub line, the grass, everything was well planned out. Even the stones which were put, they were thought of and they were put there. So those were the private gardens. Then you had the monastic gardens, or the gardens next to the monastery, which were basically supposed to be there for your so that you could go out there and sit in the quiet environments and meditate. So those were the monastic gardens. And the last of all, the gardens in the resorts. So all the resorts which were there, that's where the garden architecture was. So these are the 4 styles of architecture that we have in China. We have the Imperial architecture style, we have the Buddhist architectural style, Taoist architectural style, and the garden architecture. You can have a look at the pictures which are going to come now, which just understand all these architectural styles.